What happens when a Hollywood legend faces a host who knows no boundaries? This moment on Good Morning America went viral, shocking audiences and sparking heated discussions across social media. No one was prepared for what unfolded when Clint Eastwood, an icon of cinema, took a seat across from Robin Roberts. What began as a routine interview to promote a new film quickly escalated into a tense battle of principles, dignity, and respect. The morning at the Good Morning America studio buzzed with its usual energy. Bright spotlights bathed the stage in warm light, and the live audience hummed with anticipation. Cameras whirred, operators adjusted angles, and producers and headsets exchanged hurried instructions. On the giant screen behind the hosts, clips from Clint Eastwood's latest Western flickered, his newest directorial project, already dubbed his swan song, at the age of 95. The audience erupted in applause as Robin Roberts, smiling and vibrant, introduced the guest. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the legendary actor, director, and Oscar winner, Clint Eastwood. Her voice was warm, but a glint in her eyes hinted that this broadcast would be anything but ordinary. Clint Eastwood entered the stage with a slow, confident stride. His figure, tall, slightly stooped, yet still commanding, radiated quiet strength. Gray hair, deep wrinkles, and a piercing gaze, he was the embodiment of old-school Hollywood. Dressed in a simple dark suit, understated yet elegant, he acknowledged the crowd with a brief nod and a faint smile before sitting across from Roberts. The co-host, George Stephanopoulos, sat nearby, clutching notes, his face a mask of professional courtesy. "Clint, welcome to Good Morning America," Robin began, her voice melodic but edged with a challenge. "Your new film is already generating buzz. But tell us, what's it like returning to Westerns at 95? Don't you think the genre, well, feels a bit outdated?" The audience fell silent. The question sounded innocent, but it carried a subtle sting. Eastwood raised an eyebrow, his gaze sharpening, yet he responded calmly, his voice gravelly with his signature rasp. "Westerns aren't about trends, Robin. They're about people. About struggle. About what's right. If that's outdated, then I must have missed the memo when humanity went out of style." The audience chuckled, some clapping. Robin smiled, but her eyes narrowed. George Stephanopoulos nervously adjusted his tie, sensing the atmosphere in the studio beginning to tighten. Robin leaned forward, clutching a tablet with notes. Her smile remained, but a hint of sarcasm crept into her tone. "Clint, you're known for your, let's say, straightforward stance. You're not afraid to speak your mind, especially on politics. But some say your views, like your films, belong to another era. What do you say to accusations that you've lost touch with today's world?" The studio went quiet. Cameras zoomed in on Eastwood's face. His jaw tightened ever so slightly, but he remained composed. The audience exchanged glances, some pulling out phones, sensing this could be the moment. George Stephanopoulos tried to intervene. "Robin, I think Clint meant that his films touch on timeless themes." But Robin raised a hand, gently but firmly cutting him off. "Hold on, George, I want to hear what Clint has to say." She turned back to Eastwood, her gaze sharper. "You understand that younger generations want to see activism, clear statements, not just cowboy stories, right?" Eastwood leaned back in his chair, his fingers lightly tapping the armrest. He looked directly at Robin, his eyes carrying a mix of irritation and patience. "Robin, I make films about what I see. About people who fight for what they believe in. If the younger generation wants to shout on social media instead of acting, that's their choice. I'm not here to babysit them." The audience gasped. Some laughed, others clapped, but most sat in tense silence. Robin Roberts didn't back down. Her smile grew colder. "So you're saying social media activism is an action? Interesting. Because many believe your films, iconic as they are, glorify individualism that, how should I put it, ignores modern issues. Like the climate crisis or social justice. Have you ever thought about using your platform for something bigger?" The tension in the studio was palpable. Producers and headsets began whispering frantically, one signaling an operator to keep a close-up on Eastwood. George Stephanopoulos glanced nervously between Robin and the audience, his hands clutching his notes. The audience was split. Some nodded at Robin's words, others murmured indignantly in Eastwood's defense. Clint leaned forward, his voice quieter but more piercing. You want me to make films about climate? Fine, I'll shoot a western where a cowboy fights a dust storm. But I'm not a preacher, Robin. I tell stories. And if you think my films don't mean anything, maybe you just haven't watched them closely enough. The audience erupted in applause, but Robin pressed on. She set down her tablet and crossed her arms, her tone sharper. Clint, I respect your legacy, but let's be honest. Some say you avoid modern issues because they're inconvenient. You're an icon, but isn't it time to step aside for new voices? Don't you think your time has passed? A deafening silence fell over the studio. Cameras whirred, capturing every moment. An operator accidentally bumped a tripod, the faint clatter echoing like a gunshot. George Stephanopoulos opened his mouth but found no words. The audience held its breath, some visibly stunned. Eastwood stared at Robin, his eyes narrowing, his jaw clenching. The moment no one expected was approaching. The Good Morning America studio was frozen in tense silence after Robin Roberts' provocative question hung in the air like a challenge. Wasn't it time for Clint Eastwood to step aside for new voices? Cameras whirred, capturing every move, while the audience, holding their breath, awaited the response of a Hollywood legend. What happened next became a moment etched in television history. Clint Eastwood sat motionless, his piercing gaze locked on Robin. His fingers, which had been lightly tapping the armrest, stilled. The studio was so quiet that the click of a stagehand's heels backstage rang out like a shot. George Stephanopoulos, the co-host, cleared his throat nervously, attempting to defuse the situation. Robin, maybe we should get back to the film, he began, but Robin shot him a glance, her eyes flashing. Hold on, George, she said, not taking her eyes off Eastwood. I want to hear what Clint thinks. You're not afraid of tough questions, are you, Clint? The audience gasped. Some pulled out phones, already recording, sensing the moment was about to go viral. Producers in headsets whispered frantically, one signaling an operator to keep a close-up on Eastwood's face. His wrinkles, deep and expressive, seemed even more pronounced under the bright lights. But his eyes held no anger, only a calm, steely confidence. Robin, Eastwood began, his voice low but sharp as a blade. I was making films before you were born. I told stories about people who fight, who love, who make mistakes. You call that outdated? Fine. But tell me, what's new about attacking someone live on air for ratings? The audience erupted. Some clapped, others exchanged shocked glances. Robin Roberts leaned back slightly, her smile frozen, but she quickly regained her composure. It's not an attack, Clint, she said, her tone growing sharper. It's a conversation. People want to know if someone with your platform and your history can speak to what matters today. Or are you just hiding behind your cowboys and guns, dodging real issues? Now George Stephanopoulos couldn't stay silent. He leaned forward, his voice trembling with discomfort. Robin, I think we're veering off topic. Clint, tell us about your new film. But Robin cut him off, this time more sharply. George, I'm leading this conversation, she said, her eyes still on Eastwood. Clint, you understand that your approach, this lone hero individualism, can feel disconnected from reality? The world has changed. People want leaders who talk about climate, equality, justice. And you're giving us another Western. The studio was deathly silent. Even the operators seemed to freeze, afraid to miss a moment. The audience was divided. Some nodded in agreement with Robin, others grumbled in Eastwood's defense. A producer backstage muttered a curse into his headset, realizing the broadcast was spiraling out of control. Eastwood leaned forward slowly, his hands clasped on his knees. His voice, gravelly and low, cut through the silence like a gunshot in a western. You want me to be a leader? I'm not a politician, Robin. I'm not an activist. I make films that make people think. You accuse me of staying silent on climate or justice? Fine. But what are you doing, besides sitting here throwing accusations for a good show? The audience roared with applause, mixed with some boos and shouts in Robin's favor. The camera swung to Roberts, whose face briefly betrayed irritation before she slipped back into her professional mask. "This isn't about a show, Clint," she said, her voice colder. "It's about responsibility. You're an icon. Your words carry weight. But when you stay silent on what matters, it looks like indifference. Or maybe you just don't care?" That was too much. Even George Stephanopoulos, who had tried to stay neutral, clenched his fists under the desk. Producers backstage shouted into headsets, urging the director to cut to commercial. But the moment had arrived. Clint Eastwood rose slowly from his chair. His movements were deliberate, carrying the weight of decades of experience. The studio froze. The audience held its breath, cameras whirring to capture every second. He stood tall and unyielding, his eyes burning with quiet strength. "Robin," he began, his voice calm but piercing. "I've lived 95 years. I've seen wars, crises, people rise and fall. I've made films about heroes and the weak, about those who fight and those who give up. You say I'm silent? My films speak for me. They speak about dignity, about respect, about what it means to be human. If you don't see that, maybe you're just not looking." The audience erupted in applause, louder than ever. Some stood, others shouted in support. Robin Roberts opened her mouth to respond, but Eastwood raised a hand, silencing her. "And one more thing," he continued, his voice softer but even more piercing. "You want to talk about responsibility? Start with yourself. Stop using your platform to tear people down for ratings. Respect the people sitting in front of you. Respect their work. Respect their lives. Because if you don't, you're no better than the ones you criticize." The studio exploded. Applause mixed with whistles and shouts. Some audience members recorded on their phones, their faces alight with shock and awe. Robin Roberts sat stunned, her hands gripping the edge of the desk. George Stephanopoulos looked as if he wanted to disappear. Producers backstage shouted into headsets, demanding an immediate cut to commercial, but the director seemed too captivated to act. Eastwood turned to the audience, his gaze softening. "And to you, people," he said, gesturing to the crowd and the cameras. "Don't let anyone tell you your work, your stories, or your values are outdated. Do what you believe in. And do it with dignity." With that, he turned and walked off the stage. His steps were slow but steady, the click of his shoes echoing in the silence. The audience erupted in ovation, some crying, others chanting his name. Robin Roberts sat in silence, her face pale. George Stephanopoulos finally snapped out of his daze and hurriedly called for a commercial break, but the moment had already become legendary. When the broadcast returned after the break, Robin Roberts forced a professional smile, but her voice trembled. George Stephanopoulos quickly shifted to another topic, but the studio still buzzed with tension. On social media, clips of Eastwood's speech went viral, racking up millions of views in minutes. The hashtag Eastwood Speaks trended at number 1. Comments were divided. Some called Eastwood a hero for defending his dignity and legacy. Others backed Robin, arguing she had the right to ask tough questions. Headlines flooded the media. Clint Eastwood humiliates Good Morning America host, Hollywood legend versus the modern world. Did Robin Roberts cross the line? This clash became a defining moment in television history, a collision of old-school values and the modern world. Clint Eastwood left the studio with his head held high, but his words lingered with everyone, those who cheered him and those who criticized him. Robin Roberts, despite the shock, continued hosting, but her reputation took a hit. Some accused her of unprofessionalism, while others defended her right to ask hard-hitting questions. What do you think? Was Clint Eastwood right to stand up for his legacy? Did Robin Roberts have a point in pushing him? Can art be an answer to modern problems, or must it give way to activism? Share your thoughts in the comments and join the conversation.